All right, coming up on tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, we're going to talk about porn and purity. A discussion with Josh Broome coming up next.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros. I'm the managing editor of CBN's FaithWire.com, joined as always by Billy Hallowell. Billy, what's going on?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. I'm looking forward to our conversation today because we can't have this conversation enough. I mean, over the years of this show, we've periodically come back to this topic because it's so pervasive now. And Billy, I know you know the numbers, and Barna has put out extensive studies on porn and sexual sin, and even the number of pastors and the number of churchgoers that are engaging in porn. And most disturbingly, I find, Billy, this one shocking, is that the dial on people who view porn as a moral choice is increasing. And so because it's so pervasive, I think we can't talk about it enough. And our guest today is the perfect person to talk about it.
Yeah, and just before we get to Josh Broome, the two most disturbing things, you mentioned one, which is it's a problem in the church, pastors, youth pastors, people who are leading churches really struggling with this, high percentages. And then also young kids. The age keeps getting younger and younger of when kids are exposed to this. So it's a massive problem. And as you were saying, who better to speak to it than Joshua Broome? Josh, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, man. Always a good time talking to you.
So, Josh, your story, just so people who don't know, you worked in the porn industry for how long? How many years?
Almost 6 years. So I was in the porn industry from 2006 to the very end of 2012.
And you've shared your story, and I kind of want to start here because we want to break down your story first and then get into some of the issues, obviously, that you're passionate about. But you left porn, and you didn't have this epiphany where you became a Christian and you left porn because of that. You left the industry, and there was a couple of year period before you became a Christian. So let's just kind of start with, what was it that made you, after more than 6 years, stop and say, oh my goodness, I need to leave this behind. I can't do this anymore?
Yeah. So over a 6-year period, I was in over 1,000 films, and it progressively grew a depression that I tried to suppress, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And the actual pinnacle of my career was the pinnacle of my depression. So I win Male Performer of the Year, which is the highest award that a male could win in that industry. And I didn't even show up to the award show because I was at home on my face, ready to take my own life. So that depression grew to a point where, not even wanting to be in the industry, but I didn't want to live. And I pretty much made the decision. It's like, either, I'm going to quit or I'm going to die. And I walk into a bank and I have an interaction with someone who calls me by my name, which I hadn't heard for over a year because I isolated myself from my friends and my family. It almost kind of snapped me out of this fog I was in. And I very quickly packed my bags and I ran home to my mom. I quit.
When you say, just to clarify, when you say you heard your name, you heard your real name,
right?
Joshua, because you were only known by your stage name, correct?
Yeah. So everyone in the porn industry, which should highlight a level of shame, no one goes by their name. No one goes by their real name. At minimum, someone attaches a fictitious last name or something, but I went by the name that I went by was not my real name. And I isolated myself from every authentic relationship that I had. So no one was calling me by Josh or Joshua. It was just my stage name. And that went on for so long that I hadn't even heard my name. So when I heard my name, it was shocking, ultimately in the best of ways.
Mm. Josh, what do you make now of, as I mentioned in those stats, you see even among Christians, there's this normalization, or it's becoming a more morally acceptable choice by an increasing number of people. So what do you think when you see that?
I mean, the reality is, um, because we are so slow to tell people the truth because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings, we feel like we're doing them a favor. But the reality is, those people desperately need to hear the truth because that's something that I did not hear. And when you justify something, it's easy to go back to it. So that's what's happening in our culture. We live in a way where we're tiptoeing around the truth and we don't want to talk about it. So that's why sex in general is such a big deal, because it's not discussed. It must be taboo, and people are finding out and forming the opinions about this on their own instead of looking at what truth says.
I mean, how sad is it that, and I know this is true because I teach at college, that talking about legalizing sex work is a more normative position. People look at you like you're more sane than if you say, I'm a Christian, right? Like I'm a Bible believing Christian. Like that's kind of the strange place we're in right now in culture, and which makes it hard to talk about these issues. But that makes your story that much more important, because when people like you speak about it, I think people are paying attention. They want to understand, what is it that made this guy leave, right? But then after you left, you didn't just leave, you became a Christian 2 years later. What was it that made, and I know it's probably more of a complicated answer than what I'm going to throw out as the question, but what made you go down that path?
Yeah, I mean, I think like winning the trophy, winning the male performer of the year, traveling the world, making over $1 million, being famous to a certain degree, all those things, I think what it allowed me to experience is all the things that I believed would make me happy didn't work. And it illuminated my brokenness. It illuminated the necessity for something that I didn't have. And then when I was presented with the gospel paired with the truth that is Jesus Christ, it was undeniable, and it filled the gap in a way that nothing else did. So for me, I had tried everything else, and this makes the most sense. And I wasn't basing it on feelings. I was basing it on facts and truth, and that led me into freedom.
Can I just to pause on that? You had that gap, then you are introduced to Christianity. What was that introduction? I'm always interested to hear how God saves people. So was it sort of a process for you, or did God just kind of open your eyes in an instant, or what happened?
Yeah, so long story really short, I started personal training at a gym, worked my way up, became a manager at another gym, and then I met a girl, and we went on a run, and she asked me some really tough questions. She asked me ultimately, did I know who God was? Did I have a relationship with God? And the answer was ultimately no. And we ended up going to church together the next week. But something she said to me really stuck out to me, because when I told her about my past, which was incredibly difficult, and which is what I did not do leading up to that, I lied to everyone I met. It's like I did acting and modeling or whatever. I would say everything other than what I actually did in California. But to her, I was honest. And she told me that, well, you're not your biggest mistake, and you're not your biggest victory. That's not who you are. God defines who you are. And that was really challenging for me, because my whole life had been defined as, my shame, my guilt, my lacking a father, like all these things. Like, this is how I saw myself. And she challenged that. And then soon after that, we ended up going to church together. And then I hear this message about Mephibosheth and how he was broken. He thought he deserved death, but David was a different kind of king. Instead of wiping out the whole lineage of the previous kingdom, he wanted to know where Mephibosheth was. And he gave him a seat at his table, not for a day, not for a week, but forever. And then it's like, so much more does Jesus do for us. And in a lot of ways that resonated with me in a way where it opened my eyes. So it was someone who spoke truth gently to me. So a real Colossians 4, 5, and 6 moment where her speech and her interaction cultivated a curiosity and broke down some boundaries. And then when I heard the truth of the gospel, it made its way to my heart.
So that's incredible. And I think it's a testament to the fact that we don't know how our interactions with people are going to change them. The simple interactions. And in your life, this resulted in obviously, a whole different life and marriage and kids and all these other things that, you thought were not possible when you were working in porn, right? But then you make this other, kind of crazy jump, an amazing jump. And you're like, I'm not only am I a Christian now, I'm going to be a pastor, right? Like this is where God has called me. How did you discover that? And how do people react to that when they learn that that's where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reaction has changed over time. I think initially it was, it's like, that's cute, but the reality is, that was 7 years ago, and it's not something that I dreamed about that I would be one day. It was something that God laid on my heart, and it was so undeniable I couldn't do anything else. But, through a 4.5, almost 5-year internship, being on staff at 2 different churches, getting a theological education, a Christian ministries degree with a focus on biblical theology, like spending the time doing the work and cultivating, the desire and having the knowledge along the way. It's like, man, if you're doing something really difficult you don't want to do, you're probably going to stop doing it. But I found as I went on this journey, not only did I love it, I felt like it was what I was destined to do. So absolutely, I've had a lot of pushback. I still do. I think someone that currently has 1,000 films that are still on the internet, and I hope they're gone one day, but the reality is they might always be there. Someone says, hey, how can you preach God's word and you have this tangible sin, like very easily accessible? And I'm like, man, I'm actually in great company, because Moses killed a guy, David was an adulterer, and ultimately committed secondhand murder. Peter denied Jesus, so on and so on. And all those things are found in the Bible, which is the greatest selling book of all time. And it's there for a reason, because when God meets people in the middle of their mess, he can do anything with them and through them. But I think it's just allowing people to know, man, you don't have to stay where you are, and you can become whatever it is that God has created you to be, regardless of what you've done in the past.
We got to take a break. I want to dive into this more. It's a big topic, porn and purity. On the other side of the break, this is Faith versus Culture. Be right back. All right, we're back. This is Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell there. We're joined by ex-porn star Josh Broome, and pastor. I should say pastor, and as you were just talking about in the last segment, like that is not who you are. And you are who you are as God defines you, and not the things that we do. So I almost feel weird even introducing you that way, although I understand why it's relevant to our conversation talking about sexual sin and porn. And so that's where I wanted to go with you next here in this segment, Josh, is where do you see the church, how good of a job are they doing addressing sexual sin? It's so pervasive, as we said, or how bad of a job are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not doing a very good job at all. I think we're doing a good job of talking around it. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, if you don't, it's like that thing in the corner. It's like, maybe it'll go away, maybe it won't. But the reality is it's getting worse. And my question would be, how many high-level organizations have practical things put in place to address this? Not just to the attendees. I'm talking about the people on staff. Like, who is holding these people accountable? And not in a sense where, software on their phones or their devices, having conversations where you're creating the grace and the space that you need to unpack that. And in the reality is, these people who are shepherding people who are struggling with this as well, as the numbers tell us. And I love this analogy, is where a shepherd is in a pasture, and you have this portion of the pasture that you can't go into because you don't have access to it because you're struggling with it yourself. And 2 Timothy 2:20 talks about, that there'll be vessels of gold and silver and vessels of gold of wood. And ultimately, your level of purity is going to impact your level of effectiveness. And how can I be effective in shepherding and leading and teaching something from a heart of, I want you to do this, that, and this, when I'm not doing it myself? And I think that is the stronghold that's within the church, because we're too afraid to say, hey, I'm struggling because we have this aesthetic appearance where I need to be perfect. And only Jesus is perfect. And when we keep comparing ourselves to one another, trying to get more views, blue check marks, and all these things, we keep chasing after affirmation and trying to copy one another and trying to one up one another, we're not going to ever deal with the real issues. So until people start being real, we'll continue to struggle.
So how do we, in light of that, you talk about pastors, they're in such a difficult role. Everyone's looking to them. Everyone's saying, this is the person who's, as you were saying, going to shepherd us. And I think that makes pastors feel like they can't be honest about the struggles they're having. And so it then becomes a secret sin. And we know, this is documented. We have statistics and data. Josh McDowell and others have measured this, telling us what a problem this is. This is, I don't even know. It dawned on me as you were talking. I'm thinking, how do we help within our churches, even as congregants, create an environment where everyone, not just the people in the church, but those leading it, can be guided in a way that helps address these issues?
Yeah, that's something that I'm passionate about actually implementing and orchestrating myself. Is like, I want to provide pastors with pastors. I think that we live in a world where we think the person on top doesn't need checks and balances, and we all do. So people need an accountability partner. People need someone that you can be honest and real with, because you're only as free as you're honest. And if you're not completely free, you're in bondage and you're held back. So I think through someone establishing some checks and balances, and in a systematic way, making sure that everyone is being cared for, including the person at the top.
Yeah, that is very true. And, we created a course here at Faithware a couple of years ago called setfreecourse.com. And that is one way, because as you mentioned, Josh, just putting the software on your phone, while it's good to have something, that doesn't really get at the heart and the desires that we want to have as Christians. And you have to almost, stir your affections for Christ in order to be desiring the things in Christ. And so we try to address those heart issues on that setfreecourse.com. And we can always add content to it. So I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah,
as well.
I love what you said about the heart. I love what you said about the heart, because the reality is Judas had the best teacher. He had the access to all the great things. If you needed it, he had access to it. But it was the heart issue that led him to still betray Jesus. So until we address the issue in the heart, which is it's going to have to be hard conversations, and you're going to have to create a space where those people can be honest.
Yeah. Well, and how do you help other people as Christians? This is for everybody, not just pastors. How are we to help other people if we have these secret sins, if we aren't, especially with how dark culture is and how we know it's going to get worse? We're just scratching the surface probably on how crazy some of this is going to get. We need to all be spiritually healthy and working on those things in our hearts so we can help others.
Yeah, I'm going to say something controversial, but I think it's really easy to point fingers at Joel Osteen when all this stuff is going on. But the reality is, what is he doing? He is not trying to be someone else. And I think authenticity is the place that God will thrive. God will thrive in authenticity. And we live in a culture where we are trying to be like everyone else. Everyone has their favorite pastor, their favorite leader, their favorite motivational speaker. And we try to look like, shape our lives, and become like this person. But the reality is, God cannot bless the person that you pretend to be. And until you put all your cards on the table, you're never going to be the person that God wants to work in and through. So I think it's just leading through vulnerability. And that is the thing that's going to allow us to heal as a church.
All right, we got time for one more segment with Josh Broome. We'll be back on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. All right, we're back on Faith versus Culture. We have time for some closing thoughts with Josh Broome. Josh, you were just telling me about a question that you get often, and I want you to address this one. Tell me the question and your response to it.
Yeah, so more often than not, I get a question. It's, what are you going to tell your kids about your past? So I have 3 young boys that are under 4, and people often ask me, what are you going to tell your children? And the reality is, I'm going to have a very difficult, honest conversation with them. And I think when we love people, we choose to be honest, even when it hurts. Sometimes it's going to hurt them. Sometimes it's going to hurt you. But what hurts the most is when you don't tell the truth to someone you love, and then they find out their own way. And the worst thing that my kids could ever do is find out on their own and have someone else tell my story to them. So it's an opportunity to show integrity, to extend trust, and just to have a really difficult conversation, because that is where healing happens. When we have conversations that are hard, but we do that because we love them.
That is a great point. And regardless of what your past is, I think, Billy, you mentioned earlier, I think probably everybody has these secret little bugaboos and sins in their closet that they don't want people to know about. And and you're right, Josh. I mean, you gotta hit those head on, because if you don't, I think, like you said earlier, you're going to be living sort of in captivity to that. And and then, as you said, in a worst case scenario, they find out the other way, and then, why didn't you tell me? And you're taking away the power and the chance to show God's goodness, how he pulled us out of those situations.
And to model that they can do that in their own lives too, right? When they make a mistake, when they go through something, that's a huge.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the case with like any aspect of your past. Either you get the power to own it, or you allow it to own you.
That's
all right. Well, absolutely good word. And Josh, that's all the time we have for today. Really appreciate you taking a few minutes to join us here on Faith versus Culture.
Oh, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
All right. We'll be right back. All right, that's all the time we have for this episode. Thank you so much for being here. As always, we'll be back next week, and we'll be praying for you throughout the week. Have a great one. God bless.